The money that's in your bank account, the money that's in your wallet, how would you best define it?
Guys?
Agreed consensus of a medium of exchange.
Yep.
So everyone agreeing that $1 is worth $1. Right here?
A trust currency.
A trust currency, yes, exactly.
Oh, one last question.
Just a trading source.
Yes, makes it a lot easier than
You
carrying
know,
a chicken or
that's
a goat
exactly
with
right.
you to trade for.
We only have so much land because we can't store all the camels.
One good definition of this, money must be a store of value and maintain its purchasing power for a long period of time. So could I ask anyone in the crowd here, which one of these is not like the other? Before anyone yells that out, could we have someone run the mic around? Anyone can answer that? Yes,
right.
down the front here. Oh, 1 minute. Sorry.
Yeah, so money started with gold backup, and then the gold backup disappeared. It's the Americans who started it.
Yes, it is.
So we practically trust something that has no value in gold, not the total value in gold. It's like the Romans tried to do that long times ago. You know, they had coins and actually they're not real underneath, and some
Diluted
emperors did that.
Yeah,
So, you know, then you have inflation and the rest.
yeah, exactly.
Yep.
Yeah, the Romans first started taxing them, so they would cut the edges off of their coins.
Exactly.
And then when they couldn't do that anymore, they started putting one metal with another, so they dilute it.
So
Very similar to what they do
yeah,
today.
when you ask the question, what's Bitcoin? I would say Bitcoin is a virtual dollar, you know, because maybe Bitcoin is more trustworthy than the dollar, but we don't know because banks play with dollars, and that's
That's the big difference. Banks play with dollars and
exactly,
they
and
can't play with
Bitcoin
cryptocurrencies.
does
Yes.
not have that.
Yes.
Yeah.
Okay.
All right. Anyone else? The main thing we're trying to get out here is that this is paper, and this is paper, and this is gold.
Yeah.
There's no real intrinsic value between this and this other than it's paper. And this is the only reason this has value is because it's deemed valued by government.
And the gold, there's not one country in the world that can say, this is what the price of gold is. It's actually the fair market that, you know, it is manipulated a little bit here and there, but it's the fair market that actually determines what the price of that is. And it's usually, you know, there's obviously on top of what it costs to get it out of the ground. These other two, they can print as much as they want. And they do.
All right.
Fast
Got it.
forward, rewind.
Beautiful. Does everyone know that in 1971, Nixon actually removed the gold standard from the Bretton Woods? Yeah. So at the moment, there's over 200 different currencies around the world today that are now fiat currencies. So for anyone that doesn't know what a fiat currency is, the definition is, fiat currency refers to any money lacking intrinsic value and that is declared legal tender by a government. Fiat currency is not backed by any commodity such as gold, but only by the faith of the bearer, which is everyone in this room and everyone else. So, what happens when we leave this type of power to governments and central banks? Everyone got an idea? They create money, and they create a lot of it. So this is actually the world's currency debts at the moment. These aren't in numerical order, but as you can see, America's up the top with over $21 trillion in debt at the moment.
Australia's at
And
the bottom.
Australia's down the bottom here, almost 700 billion. And let's not forget, that's just the debt on the surface, but then we have unfunded obligations as well. So these are things like promises of future retirement and medical benefits that you may have already heard about, government promising to expand future retirements and pension funds and so forth. Estimated range in America alone is between 80 to 20 trillion, which they don't talk about too much. That's just, no one actually has an actual set figure for that, but that's just what the low and high end range of that figure is. And just as a comparison, there's about $90.4 trillion currently circulating around in either digital money or notes and checks and so forth. So that gives you a bit of an idea on how hard it will be to actually pay this out, just in America alone as well.
And so just to give you guys an example, it's really easy for us to just say 1 million, 1 billion, 1 trillion. Let's actually wrap our heads around how much money that really is. So $1 million stacked up is the height of the chairs you guys are sitting in right now today. That's $1 million. So $1 million of $100 bills stacked up is higher than the tallest building on Earth today. 1 trillion is over 2 times the height of what the space station is. So we're going from $1 million, the back of your chair, all the way to $1 trillion, which is two and a half times the height of the International Space Station. So America throws around the trillion dollar here. We need to raise the debt ceiling another couple trillion. Imagine what that's like when there's 21 of those stacked on top of themselves.
And this just comes out of thin air as well. This just is a flick of a finger, bang, quantitative easing, 2008 when they pumped out another 3.5 trillion. These are just numbers coming out and springing into existence. So, and then the thing is, guys, is that this is constantly increasing. That debt chart that I showed you before, that's constantly numbers going up and up and up and up. So you can't see this actually slowing down or going backwards. It just keeps going further and further as we lend out more loans, credit builds up, and things like quantitative easing and stimulus packages keep going on. So where does it all come from? We got central banks and commercial banks are the two main bodies of where this money keeps getting pumped from governments and central banks all around the world.
So the central banks are the ones that manage.
I'll do the clicking.
Okay, so the central banks are the one that manage each individual state's currency, the money supply, and the interest rates. So when the global financial crisis happened, they only have 2 levers to mess with. They can print more money and save us or have a soft landing, or they can lower interest rates, lower them so low artificially, we actually went into the negatives in some places.
And to give you an idea, the central bank here in Australia is the Reserve Bank of Australia, and then we also have in America the Federal Reserve, just so you guys know what the comparison is. And then commercial banks are things like our NAB, Commonwealth, ANZ. These are just the commercial banks which have the ability to give business loans, accept bank deposits, and offer basic investment products. So these aren't the ones really controlling this money flow. Oh, they are, but the central banks are the ones that print out this money.
And the central banks are actually the ones that only create 10% of the world's currency. 90% of the world's currency is actually created here in the central bank, in the commercial banks. We'll show you that later.
The numbers that get printed. So, an example, guys, just to break this down. So, politicians get elected by promising you more free stuff than their opponent. So, for example, this guy offers, vote for me and I promise to fix Perth public transport system and a bunch of other stuff. So, after that goes through, politicians vote for the country to spend more than it actually makes. So he'll go to Parliament or somewhere like into Washington, DC, and these guys will battle out whether these go through or not. So increasing the budget deficit. So essentially, the budget deficit is deficit spending is the amount by which spending exceeds revenue over a particular period of time. So an investment vehicle for governments to receive tax revenue later. So just an investment vehicle for these guys is just much like as us buying a house. It's an investment for the future. These guys are going to expand things like public transport system, stadiums, whatever the case is, and then eventually get taxed back on that at a later point.
You can think of deficit as just debt.
Yeah.
Building more and more debt that interest has to pay off.
So to summarise that, so politicians vote for more spending. Whichever one votes for gets the most spending happening. To summarise this in a nutshell, they'll go to government, battle it out, and then when that goes through, then it goes to the Treasury. So when the government agrees to fix Perth's transport system, they have the Treasury issue a bond. Now, to break down a bond.
Yeah, so a bond is just an IOU. It's saying, today, give me $1 trillion, and I promise to pay back that $1 trillion plus some. So bonds are just IOUs. Created an IOU that the Treasury creates, and then that goes onto our national debt, but then the banks actually trade money for.
Yeah. So just to summarise that again, politicians vote for more spending. Government, if they say yes or no, goes down to the Treasury, and the Treasury will then go print out these bonds, which again are just IOUs that say, pay me $1 trillion today, and I'll give you $1 trillion plus interest in 10 years' time, or whatever the case is. So then they go to a bond auction. So these are government bonds are bought by things like domestic banks, foreign banks, institutions, all willing to upfront money for Perth's public transport system with interest, and the national debt continues to go up. So this is one way how money does come into circulation. So this is another summary. So politicians vote for more spending. They go to government, they go down to the Treasury if the government says okay, they print out a bond, and then they hold this auction right here. So this is where people, it could be any central bank, it could be, this is your NAB or your Commonwealth or even foreign banks or institutions. They will actually buy these bonds here, and then they will give the Treasury this money, which they can then use for that deficit spending to actually put things like Perth's public transport system upgrades forward. So this increases our national debt, and in Australia at the moment it's around $700 billion. So what happens when central banks buy bonds? This is where it gets scary. So this increases the money supply. Buying bonds with zero balance. So these guys are withdrawing money out of a bogus bank account, more or less. Like magic, money springs into existence. So this is another quick summary here after this quote. So this is from the Federal Reserve, like I mentioned before, is the central bank in America. So when you or I write a check, there must be sufficient funds in our account to cover the check. But when the Federal Reserve writes a check, there is no bank deposit on which that check is drawn. When the Federal Reserve writes a check, it is creating money. So that's straight from the Federal Reserve Bank of Boston, putting it simply.
I wish I could write a check from nothing.
Yeah, it'd be nice. So just to summarise that then, guys, just to give you a final recap, politicians will go, right, we need more spending. Then they go to the government, I'll say, let's fix Perth's public transport system. Whoever says we'll do the most free spending, we'll go to government, battle it out, and then once that goes through Parliament, for example, then they print out these bonds. And then what the Treasury does is holds a bond auction where these bonds can be sold to central banks and other type of institutions, where they will then give upfront the cash to give the Treasury for that deficit spending. But then another thing can happen here is every now and again the central bank will open what they call an open market operation, which is essentially where they can actually go, we'll buy these bonds off these central banks, and then we'll make fake check accounts that prints off a bogus check account and brings money into circulation. So this goes over and over and over again, and our national debt keeps going up. So this is one method of how national debt keeps coming and coming. And this cycle goes on and on and on.
And the central banks, they just create this money out of nothing. And one of the biggest things that's happened is they did quantitative easing 1, 2, and 3. They printed trillions of dollars into existence. And what did they do? They actually bought assets with it. That's why the stock market has artificially gotten propped up so high that it is today. They bought assets with those, and what's the big problem now that the Fed is saying? That they need to start to liquidate some of their assets. They've got so many assets, they need to start liquidating them. Well, if they do that now, it could be one of the worst times to do that.
So is everyone still with us? It can be a little confusing. So this is why the system remains unchecked. You try to tell that to someone quickly at a barbecue and it's over the top of their head. So
Very similar to Bitcoin.
it can be very ambiguous, and that's us. That was myself and Nick trying to really smarten that down. It was very can get a little complicated because there's a lot of other things in that as well. So this cycle has actually been repeated over and over and over again since 1913 when the Federal Reserve came out. So 100 years of bankrupting your nation. Happy anniversary.
And every time that we do more and more deficit spending, it's just kicking the can down the road. It's our children, it's our grandchildren that are going to have to pay those debts off that we are utilizing today.
Yeah, and this only, like Nick mentioned before, makes up less than 10% of the money created. So where does the rest come from? Does anyone have an idea here? All right, fractional reserve banking. This is pretty scary, and this sums it up awesome. So I'll play this video quickly for you guys.
Fractional reserve lending is exactly what it says. The banks are allowed to reserve only a fraction of your deposit and loan the rest out. Although reserve ratios may vary, I'm going to use a 10% reserve ratio as our example. If you deposit $100 in your account, the bank can legally take $90 of it and loan it out without telling you. The bank must hold $10 of your deposit in reserve just in case you want some of it. These reserves are called vault cash. But why does your bank account still say you have $100 if the bank has stolen $90 of it? Because the bank left IOUs it created, called bank credit, in its place. Now I know this sounds crazy, but here it is in black and white from the Fed. Commercial banks create checkbook money when they grant a loan simply by adding new deposit dollars in accounts on their books in exchange for a borrower's IOU. These are nothing but numbers that the banks type into their computers. And even though these bank credit IOU numbers are very different from base currency numbers, because they only exist in computers, they are still currency. So now there is $190 in existence. Now the reason people take out loans from the banks is to buy something. They're going to buy a house or a car or something like that. So the borrower takes the $90 that the bank loaned to him from your account and he pays the seller of the item. But then the seller deposits that currency into his account and his bank loans out 90% of that and leaves bank credit numbers in its place. So now there's $271 in existence. This process repeats and repeats until under a 10% reserve ratio, an initial deposit of just $100 can create up to $1,000 of bank credit, all backed by $100 of vault cash, just 10%. But as I said, reserve ratios vary wildly. On some deposits, it's 10%, on others, it's 3%, and on some forms of deposits, reserve requirements are 0. The result is that the expansion of the currency supply by the banks is far greater than even this example would lead you to believe. So once again, when currency is deposited in the banks get to lend it out, and then it gets redeposited and relent, redeposited and relent, redeposited and relent over and over again, creating bank credit all the way. This is where the vast majority of our currency supply comes from. In fact, 92 to 96% of all currency in existence is created not by the government, but here in the banking system. Now,
That's fractional reserve banking for you.
Does it make it clear why some of the largest institutions in all of Australia are banks?
So guys, the fact is, we're pretty overdue. We are working for these numbers and pieces of paper being created out of thin air, plus tax. So I don't know if anyone's actually, I'm sure you guys all have, but checked out our income tax. So just to give you an idea, anywhere $18,200 or less is tax-free. That's income tax only. And then we have, say you make $37,000, then you have to pay at least $7,000 in tax. You make $90,000, you're paying a minimum of $29,000. And then 180, you're paying about $66,000. And then, for example, if you make $500,000, you're subjected to 45% tax. And this is just paying off this debt that the governments keep bringing right up and up.
And who here thinks that taxes in the future are going to go up or going to go down? More and more deficit spending, more and more unfunded liabilities like Medicare and the dole, all of these things add up and someone's going to have to foot the bill.
Exactly, and then you take in all these unfunded obligations and things like that, and it gets really scary when you start actually seeing exactly what's going on. People think you should be wearing a tin hat when you try to tell them this stuff. And so, don't forget the hidden taxes such as Medicare levies, inflation, and GST, which gets put on top of that as well. All to pay for things that we barely have a say on, yet we are subjected to price rises from inflation. So as more money comes in, prices rise because obviously more money going around, obviously these prices rise up because everyone will be buying up everything really quick.
And in 2016, my wife and I went back to the United States and I was duly shocked. Hadn't been there in almost 5 years, and go to Walmart. Walmart's no longer cheap anymore. Well, to what I had realized. I had left for years, all of a sudden, oh my gosh, look, how expensive is this? But then I went to other stores and it's even more expensive. When you live there, it just creeps up on you a little bit more every year. But when you leave and then you come back, all of a sudden you're shocked. Wow. It really hits you, and you realize that your dollar's worth less every single year. So every time you leave $100 in the bank, it's worth less every single year. And there's countries like Venezuela where they put $100 in the bank last year, it's worth $40 this year. There's runaway inflation, which is called hyperinflation, which is the next step that this can go.
This is probably one of the best scenarios of that in Zimbabwe. Starving billionaires. So, yeah, it's pretty scary what can actually happen. Yeah, so this is a pretty good chart and kind of showing you the inverse of what happens when too much currency gets printed out and what actually happens to the value of the dollar. So more currency keeps coming out, the purchasing power of that dollar keeps decreasing every year as well.
And this is another good thing to really take into account when we see that the stock market just keeps going up and up and up. But if you don't compare that against the goods and services that it can actually buy you that year, you have nothing to really go off of. So I try and have people go off of what gold in the stock market is, something we'll cover in day 3.
Then we have global recessions as well. So obviously everyone would have been here for 2008, what we went through with all that. So this is just when Lehman Brothers went down, one of the biggest banks getting around. These are just some things money can do. And even in Greece, guys, everyone remember when Greeks closed off their ATMs for people that can only take out 80 euros at any one point, even though it was their money. This is just some of the things that we're subjected to as well.
And Greece and Cyprus was just a test, really. You know, they fell over, but what could they do? There was no options for bailouts. The government literally could not bail them out. So the next best option was called a bail-in. And so what they did was they held ransom everyone's deposits that were in the bank, and they used that to bail themselves out. And a lot of people don't realize that today, Australia has bail-in laws. And they passed it when there was only 7 senators in Parliament. Yes, exactly. They slipped that one right through. And that is a very, very blatant disregard. It's the big banks that did this. They know that when this next financial collapse actually happens, there's no plan B. We have interest rates that are still so low, they can't pull that lever anymore. It can't go any lower than what it is today. They can go negative. They can pay people to borrow money. So,
yeah, a good example of that is the point when they do go to zero interest rates and people can actually borrow more than what they can actually make, and then they decide to put interest rates back up. This leaves people homeless because they can't afford those repayments. One of the things that kicked off the GFC in 2008 was actually people borrowing more than what they could, buying houses, and then they raised these interest rates because they realised they needed this money back, and then these guys were declining on their repayments. So this is just another thing that we're subjected to with our current monetary system. So while banks continue to do bailouts, quantitative easing, stimulus packages, central banks buy assets, which is credit easing, all meaning the same thing for us, which is essentially more debt. So the truth is, we're pretty well overdue for a new monetary system, and this next video really summarises that picture for everyone in this room.
Everybody thinks the US dollar is still as good as gold, and it hasn't been since 1971. This is the world monetary systems. From 1873, when Germany went on the classical gold standard, where each unit of currency is backed up by an equivalent amount of gold in the treasury. In the United States, $20 bill, $20 gold piece in the vaults. Go into any bank, slap down your currency, which was a receipt for money, a claim check on money, ask for your money, gold and silver, and they would give it to you. So this shows, this is currency, this is money. Otherwise, there was no reason for any government to store gold in their vaults and then print this currency that was backed by gold. This is what gives confidence in that, and it gives governments the ability to start this scam in the first place, where they print these receipts for gold, and then they can print more of them than gold that exists. And that happened when we got to World War I, and all the combatants stopped redemption rights. You could no longer go in the bank and trade your pounds, lira, marks, francs, no longer redeemable in gold, and they lit up the printing presses and started printing like crazy. Then between the wars, they went on something called the gold exchange standard, where currencies would be backed partially by gold. So in the United States, under the Federal Reserve Act of 1913, the Federal Reserve was allowed to put $50 worth of claim checks on gold, currency in circulation, backed up by only $20 worth of gold. So it was a 40% reserve ratio. For every $20 gold piece in the vault, they could put $50 in circulation. Then we get to 1944. Now, during both wars, Europe paid the US with gold. During World War I, the US didn't get into the war until the very end of it. We didn't really have troops on the ground here in any quantity until the last 6 months of the war. So for the first 4 years or so, we're selling you, you take all of your young men off of the farms and turn them into soldiers. You take your factories that make toasters and they start making machine guns. Your factories that made cars are now building tanks. And so you turn your economy toward war, and all of your consumer goods and your grains had to be imported from the United States, and you paid us with gold. Then in World War II, Hitler starts saber rattling in 1936, annexes Austria in 38, invades Poland in 39. Pearl Harbor wasn't until the end of 1941. We didn't have troops on the ground until, I believe, August of 42. So again, there's like 6 years where you're paying us with your gold and we're selling you stuff. This is where Americans have this myth that war is good for the economy. War is good for the economy if you're not in it and you're selling them the tools of the trade. But by the end of World War II, the US had 2/3 of all the world's monetary gold, the central bank gold, and the rest of the world had to share the other third, and Europe had none. So the world monetary system was no longer going to work, it would collapse. But we had made all these loans of dollars to Europe, so Europe was flooded with dollars. And so representatives from around the world met at Bretton Woods, New Hampshire in 1944. They came up with a new world monetary system called the Bretton Woods system, where every currency on the planet, with the exception of just a few, they would be backed by the US dollar, and the US dollar would then be backed by gold at $35 per ounce. This gave confidence to all currencies. So this gave the world stability, and it pegged all the world's currencies to each other through the dollar to gold. So there was no such thing as the Forex. Currencies didn't float. The exchange rates were fixed year after year, and this helped to make world trade boom. Then the dollar standard starts because we kept on printing dollars. Under the Bretton Woods system, there was no reserve ratio established where the US actually had to have a certain amount of gold for how many dollars we created. So we had done a bunch of deficit spending for Korea, for Vietnam, for Johnson's Great Society, and expanded the currency supply, the amount of paper dollars in circulation, and exported them all over the world. And then in the 60s, Charles de Gaulle, president of France, realizes that we don't have the gold to back up the dollars.
Le fait que beaucoup d'États acceptent par principe des dollars au même titre que de l'or entraîne les Américains à s'endetter et à s'endetter gratuitement vis-à-vis de l'étranger.
France asks for their gold and trades in the dollars, and at that point other countries saw this and start jumping on board, and the US lost 50% of its gold from 1959 to 1971, but we still had in 71 about 12 times more dollars that we had created than there was gold. And this run on the bank, basically, the US now being the bank, this is a giant worldwide bank run, because the US, for the second time, had committed a fraud and created more receipts for gold than there was gold. It's that simple. Then finally, the markets sort of sensed this, and Nixon was forced to take us off the gold standard, because if he had paid out gold until it got to zero, once we couldn't pay on some of those dollars, the entire worldwide monetary system would have collapsed. And on August 15th, 1971, all the world's currencies became fiat currency. I don't know why the rest of the world didn't rush out and hang him, but they didn't. They just all went along with this.
To our friends abroad, I give this assurance. The United States has always been and will continue to be a forward-looking and trustworthy trading partner.
There have been thousands upon thousands upon thousands of fiat currencies throughout history, and there isn't one that survived. It is a 100% failure rate. And we started this experiment where all the world's currencies would be fiat currencies simultaneously in 1971. But what we have here, 30 to 40 years, different monetary system, 30 years, 28 years, 39 years plus, what's next? The world is going to have a new monetary system in this decade that we're in. We're going to experience this huge deflationary crash around the world. The world will probably end up on some sort of new monetary system, probably after governments try and print their way out of this and cause hyperinflations of all the currencies, and people will just lose confidence in currency.
That's starting to paint the picture a little bit.
And that's even a few years old. We're actually over 43 or over 40 years old, this monetary system, which is well above the average.
Does anyone actually know when Bitcoin was created? Yep, do you reckon that was a pretty significant time when that was actually created? Right before 2008, that GFC?
Right after.
Right after, yeah.
Right after, yeah.
This community is switching to what they think is a better monetary system. A system in which banks are no longer needed because payments could be made directly from one person to another. It's November the 2nd, 2008, just 6 weeks after the Lehman Brothers collapse. And all over the world, there are panicked debates about how to save the banks. Then, on a little visited web forum for cryptographers, a document appears in which a completely new monetary system is proposed. The visionary author calls himself Satoshi Nakamoto.
These were the darkest days of the financial crisis. So that to me suggests a very clever mind that saw an opportunity, the perfect opportunity to introduce a new radical technology and a new radical approach to money and finance at just the right moment when people would be very open to making this big shift that's required to adopt a new currency.
Bitcoin is a decentralized electronic cash system that uses peer-to-peer networking along with digital signatures and cryptographics to generate currency. Now, with traditional money, think dollars, the euro, pesos, you've got a central bank, like the Federal Reserve. They issue the currency and they print more or less cash as needed, but not with Bitcoin.
It looked very different to me. I mean, as soon as I heard the word decentralized and the fact there was a network powering this currency rather than a central issuer, that immediately captured my interest as something quite different based on what little I knew about alternative currencies at that time. The government couldn't come in and shut down a server and end Bitcoin. It would have to shut down the entire internet or turn off the electricity grid to stop Bitcoin. And so that was really attractive.
So gold is kind of hard to divide. Bitcoin divides down to 8 decimal points instantly, super easily. Gold is really, really difficult to transport. If I want to transport gold from here to Moscow, it'll cost a bunch of money to do that, and it's dangerous, and you have to have armed guards and who knows what. With Bitcoin, I can send Bitcoin from here to Moscow or to Holland instantly, just like that, basically for free. I don't have to pay for a bunch of armed guards. It just happens almost like magic.
So as everyone's starting to kind of get this picture of why Bitcoin's around and what exactly it is compared to our system at the moment. So now, once you kind of go through that, it's a bit easier to explain to people what Bitcoin's all about, essentially. So